This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance here this afternoon. Both those of you who are in the room here at the Institute here in the centre of Dublin, and also those of you who are joining us online. Everybody is welcome for this last event, the last Institute event of 2025. And it's a good opportunity for me to thank all of you in the room for your great support throughout 2025. We've had a very busy and successful, I would say that year. Very, very busy with events and publications. It's been very stimulating, very interesting, in many ways very challenging year, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more of that again in 2026. So thanks for your attendance and thanks for your continued support. I think this is a particularly important event with our distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Carlo Masala. My colleague will introduce in a moment. But can I also just take a moment to thank for her support and attendance and for agreeing to chair and moderate the discussion this afternoon, Lara Marlowe, who's just taking her seat on the stage as well. So we've a lot to talk about, a terrific speaker and a great opportunity for an engagement. We're particularly delighted to work again with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung organisation, Ireland and the UK. And it's my pleasure to introduce, just to say perhaps a few introductory words, Canan Attilan, who is the director of CAS. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome also from my side on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. In case you don't know us, we are a German political foundation closely associated with the CDU, Germany's governing political party. We run more than 100 offices worldwide, and our mission is very simple: to bring people together, to exchange ideas, and to strengthen European and international cooperation. And this is why we are very delighted to partner with IIEA, which has long been a place where researchers, academicians, practitioners, and political decision makers come together to make sense of the complicated challenges in Europe, around Europe, and beyond. So seeing so many of you here and many more online, I think this is a clear signal how important the topic of our discussion today is and how strongly it resonates also in Ireland. And it obviously also a particularly timely one, with Europe reaching a crossroads, I'd say, over the future of its security. This brings me to tell you why we have brought with us Carlo Masala, Professor Carlo Masala. Obviously, he's a very renowned expert in Germany when it comes to security and military affairs. But more importantly, I think he has an exceptional ability to cut through wishful thinking and to tell us in a brutal honesty what the realities are that we are facing. And his book, If Russia Wins, which stands in the center of today's debate, is exactly doing that. It forces us to imagine what many would not prefer to contemplate. So, the goal of this event is not to draw a bleak picture, but it should help us to think more honestly and more strategically about our own future, about our responsibilities and our choices. So with that, I would like to hand over to Lara Marlov. I don't think she needs really an introduction, but just let me add, she's a renowned author, an award-winning journalist, and she's been reporting about wars, including Ukraine, for many years already. So over to you, Lara.
Thank you, Chana. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see you all here on this sunny afternoon in Dublin. This event at the IIEA has been organized in conjunction with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, UK and Ireland. Russia's war in Ukraine continues to jeopardize the security of the European continent and has created a renewed urgency to ensure that Europeans can protect themselves. Many European states are considering contingencies should Russia not be defeated in Ukraine. To discuss these contingencies and the cost of a Russian victory for Europe, we're delighted to be joined today by Professor Dr. Carlo Masala, Chair for Security and Defense Studies at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich. If you're like me, you didn't know the Bundeswehr had a university. Professor Dr. Carlo Masala is a renowned German expert on military and security policy and has published extensively on international relations, NATO, and European security. He's the author of this best-selling book, If Russia Wins, which I recommend highly, which was published this year and has topped charts across Europe and cemented his reputation as a leading voice in geopolitics. Dr. Masala will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A with our audience. To those of you who are asking questions in person, the microphone, raise your hand and I'll call on you and the microphone will be brought to you. To those of you who are joining us online, you will be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screen. And please note that today's presentation and the question and answer session are all on the record. Dr. Masala, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation as well as the Institute. I mean, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for bringing me over, and the Institute and the Foundation for organizing this event here. I feel very honored to be able to speak about the book to you and to discuss all related topics regarding the book afterwards. Let me start by giving you the reasons why I wrote a small book, If Russia Wins. The reason basically was the whole debate we had a year and a couple of months ago in Europe, when actually most military intelligence services came out with an assessment saying that by 2029, Russia might have the forces available to invade a NATO country if there is a political will to do so. And this triggered a debate in most of the European countries with regard to two things. First of all, why should the Russians be so stupid to attack a NATO country? Because they might risk that NATO will invoke Article 5. And then in such a confrontation, even the Russians don't know whether they could win such a war against NATO or not. And secondly, the argument was, look at Ukraine. The Russians have so many difficulties to advance in Ukraine. How could they even possibly think that they would win a war against one NATO country or against NATO as a whole? And my thinking was, is this really a realistic scenario? Yeah, that Russia needs to invade a NATO country. What do the Russians want? And here we start. I mean, first of all, I consider Russia as a neo-imperial power who wants to revise the European security order. And this is not something I made up or I'm making up. This is something you can read in every speech of Putin, Peskov, and all the cronies around Putin. This is the demand the Russians put forward in December 2021 in a letter to Washington and a similar letter to Brussels NATO headquarters, where basically they said, we stop a potential invasion into Ukraine if you basically agree in negotiation about a revision of the European security landscape going back to 1997. What does 1997 mean? 1997 was before NATO started to accept new members. 1997 means no American forces in Poland, in Romania, partly in Bulgaria, in the Baltic countries, and some are even saying in Kosovo. So then I continued and asked myself, why do the Russians want the US out of parts of Europe? And you can go back to the Soviet Union. In '58, the Polish foreign minister Rapaki offered a plan of a pan-European security structure. And this plan was entitled From Vladivostok to Lisbon. This is exactly what the Russians are basically offering Europe since a couple of years. A pan-European security order from Vladivostok to Lisbon. This sounds great, right? But San Francisco and Vancouver is missing. So even the Soviet Union knew that the only way to dominate a European landmass is to get the US out of Europe. To get basically the US, or to basically have the US not as a European power. So if Putin asks the withdrawal of American troops from Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltics, this is the precondition for the Russians to dominate what in early Russian history, I mean, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, was called in a security strategy, the near abroad, to dominate it politically and economically. I'm not thinking that Russia wants to basically enlarge its territory. I don't think that Russia wants to recreate the Soviet Union. That's not their policy, but they want to dominate what they consider as their legitimate forefield. And therefore they need the US out. So Russia is a revisionist power. Second assumption. Third assumption was, or my thinking was basically, if Russia wants to achieve this goal, they need to destroy NATO as a political organization. And you don't need to invade a NATO country to destroy NATO as a political organization. Quite to the contrary, if you invade full-fledgedly a NATO country, I mean, let's assume 6 Russian tank divisions are breaking through Belarus, through the Polish border, with the aim of conquering Warsaw, the chances that NATO will invoke Article 5 are quite high. But if Russia just tests NATO's resolve, NATO's ability to invoke Article 5, they probably need to do only a smaller thing. Yeah? And then I started looking at where does NATO has, Churchill used to call this in the Second World War a soft underbelly. Yeah? And you can find a couple of soft underbellies of NATO. I mean, we can talk about, you know, some piece of land in Finland where not many people are living in. You occupy this, you ramp in a Russian flag, and you claim that this is Russian territory. But you have also cities like in Norway, like in Lithuania, like in Estonia, which are close to the Russian border, which have quite substantial Russian-speaking minorities. Some of them are even Russian citizens. And then you have a perfect pretext, like the Russians did in 2014 in the Donbass, oppression of Russian minorities. I mean, look at Estonia, for instance. The Estonians, half a year ago, they adjusted their election laws to European standards, meaning that, you know this, you know, in communal elections, everyone who is a citizen of the European Union has the right to vote, regardless where he's living. So even in Ireland, you can vote as a German if you live somewhere here in Ireland in communal elections. This is what the Estonians did. But thereby, they deprived the Russian minorities of their right to elect in communal elections, which they were holding before. For Russia, this is a perfect pretext. Russian minorities' rights are oppressed. Yeah, we need to protect them. So, as I said, you have 3 cities, but you can have also an island like Spitsbergen, where there are 2 Russian, basically, settlements. Yeah, you have Gotland in Sweden, an island which so far has not been well protected. So you just occupy this small piece, And then basically you ask NATO, are you really willing? I mean, we just want to protect the rights of our minorities in the city. Are you really willing to risk a major conventional confrontation which always has a nuclear dimension just for the liberation of in my case, Narva, 50,000 inhabitant city close to the Russian border? And my assumption is, and I quote, and this I laid out in the book more extensively, I quote a friend of mine, Bastian Giegrich, who is the director of the IISS here in London, who once at the conference said, you know, if the Russians provoke something with regard to NATO, NATO will split into 3 camps. 1/3 of NATO countries would immediately want to defend NATO's territory, this city, this particular place the Russian occupy. 1/3 would want to start immediately negotiations with the Russians, and 1/3 will hope that everything will end very soon. So in my scenario, basically, you have this occupation of the city of Narva. You have a very clear message by the Russians. It's just about Narva. We just want, you know, protect the rights of our minorities. We don't want to go further. But if you react, and if you start a military campaign to get us out of Narva, we are ready to fight until the last Russian for this city. And at this point, politically, NATO will collapse, because there is not much appetite to fight the Russians over a small piece of land. But if you refuse to defend even the smallest piece of NATO territory somewhere in the east, NATO is losing its rationale. Because of course we are all used since the 90s to look at NATO as a community of values, you know, projecting stability and so on and so forth. But at the core of NATO is the promise to defend the territory of its member states. And if you start debates whether a city is enough to invoke Article 5 or not, and you don't invoke Article 5, then actually NATO has lost its function. Because every NATO member gives us part of its sovereignty in the realm of defense policy to be protected by other NATO members, to have this kind of commitment. So why should you stick to this alliance if this alliance doesn't defend even the smallest inch of your territory? And this is actually my scenario. My scenario is just, we have a neo-imperial Russia who, if it is rewarded in Ukraine, and everything right now looks very much like that Russia will be rewarded in Ukraine, will not stop in Ukraine. Because the Russians are telling us that the war against Ukraine is not only a war against Ukraine. The Russians are telling us that this is a war about the European security architecture, against the European security architecture. And I would even add that this is a war which is part and central for one question we are all right now in: what will be the international order of the future? Because if Russia gets away with its aggression, this might have some effects to the rest of the world. Let's rephrase MAGA in the German term: make war of aggression great again, make Angriffskrieg great again. So what should stop China from moving into Taiwan if they basically see how the West, in vertical commas, is not politically willing and able to give to the Ukrainians whatever they need to basically fight the Russians in Ukraine? So thereby, therefore, the last chapter of this book is a conversation between the Russian president, which in my book is, you know, someone else than Putin, and the Chinese president, Xi, where basically the Russian president says, you know, history is moving faster than in the last 100 years. And the Chinese president answered, yes, and we are in the driving seat. And this is exactly the conversation Putin had with Xi a year ago at Sochi, which was recorded. There was a hot mic, which was recorded. When they had a break in their bilateral meetings, they went outside, and basically Putin said, you know, history is moving faster than in the past 100 years. And Xi answered, yes, and we are in the driving seat. For Russia and China, this is a war about a new world order. If Russia succeeds, this is one of the major blocks that what the Russians and the Chinese and others do want, the end of the liberal world order, I'm shying away always from saying the rule-based world order, because I think, this is misleading, because every world order will be a rule-based world order. The question for me is whether I like those rules or not. So even a Chinese-dominated world order is going to be a rule-based order, but according to Chinese rules, which I detest pretty much. Yeah. But the point is, if the Russians are winning, this is not only a major defeat for the Europeans, for transatlantic affairs, but it's also a major defeat for what we, most of us would like to, even in a reformed way, would like to uphold. It's the liberal world order. And the last point, and this is something for more the military connoisseurs, my scenario of a Russian attack against NATO's territory doesn't start at the eastern flank. It starts in Mali, where basically Russian paramilitary troops are pushing people, are taking them out of the houses and pushing them, through Africa to the Mediterranean coast and putting them on boats to get over the Mediterranean. Why do I start in Mali? There is a similar development in the South China Sea, where China basically provokes a minor incidents against Vietnam over an archipelago. Why do I start my scenario in Africa and in the South China Sea? Because we know very much that China and Russia are looking at the world as one global theater. And we are very much focused on regions. All of our militaries are very much focused on regions. They're looking at the eastern flank, they're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, but they don't connect the dots. So if I were a Russian and I would like basically to invade NATO, or a part of NATO, I would start making trouble somewhere else. Because what is going to happen if we have a migration crisis in Europe? The Europeans will be obsessed and will try to manage that. So they will be distracted from the eastern flank, focusing on the Mediterranean. What are the Americans doing whenever something happens somewhere in the world where their interests are threatened? They send over a carrier strike group. So even the US will be distracted. And this leaves the way open now, to use a very good German military term, for the Hauptstoßrichtung, which then is the city in Estonia. So this is something for the military connoisseurs, but it's very important to remind people that actually the enemies of the liberal world order are looking at the world as a global staging area. While we are very much focused on regions, and thereby we miss sometimes the bigger picture of what is going on. So this is a quarter which was allocated to me. I hope I gave a brief introduction into this small book. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Doctor. It's a very sobering scenario that you've painted for us. I would like to use my privilege as the moderator to ask the first question, which is something that it's a kind of a theoretical or philosophical, perhaps provocative question. You talk about the liberal world order. We use the term the West with a capital W.
Yeah.
And we've all grown up in the West, and we thought we had Western values. But the senior partner, or the parent, if you like, of the West is the United States of America. And this year we have seen the US basically defect to Russia. And Donald Trump is basically a Russian agent.
Yeah.
And he's trying to force Volodymyr Zelensky to capitulate to Russia right now. Is there still a West? How do you define the West now? Does it still exist, or is the West over? Is it dead?
I would have argued since the mid of the 90s that the West as a political unity has already gone. Because what the West was composed of, of course, there are historical ties, there are cultural ties, there are family ties between the US and Europe. But actually, the West was created by the Soviet threat. Yeah, this put the West together. Once the Soviet threat had gone, the West as a political unity disappeared. We are moving now into another phase, and which is even more complicated, because the West was reinvented or recreated for a short time due to the Russian threat. Going back to the Biden administration, yeah, there we had the West as we used to know it in the Cold War. The problem with the Trump administration is not only that they look at this whole war of Russia against Ukraine differently from a political perspective and a military perspective, but the national security strategy, sorry to say, but basically declared the Europeans as the enemy of the US. So what actually what I would always have argued, until 2 years ago, to say, yeah, but we have some common values, we have cultural ties. This is gone. I mean, for the US, we are in a civilizational decline. Yeah. So we're in a civilizational decline. We're about to commit suicide from their perspective. What they would like to have here in Europe is something Europe probably used to be the last time in the 50s and the 60s after the Second World War. Yeah. They are basically blaming the migration policy. I mean, you can have, arguments with migration policies in 2015 as you like, but contributing to the decline of Europe. They are looking at Europe as a continent where in 30 years from now, non-white people will be in the majority of the population in most of the countries. So basically, they declared war on Europe. Because the solution for them is to say, we're going to support those parties who share the same values than the MAGA movement, which actually in Europe are mostly, not entirely, but I would say mostly, right-wing extremist parties. And the first reaction was that the ambassador to France met Le Pen and Bardella to be informed about, the party program of the Rassemblement National. The second thing is that one of our foreign spokesmen of our right-wing extremist party was invited to a dinner by the Young Republicans and got an award. And he got the award for his fight against liberalism. Yeah. So we are in a completely different situation right now. The West, is no longer a political unity, but from a US perspective, the West is also no longer a kind of civilizational entity.
Thank you. Questions? Raise your hands, please. And always, please remember to identify yourself and your affiliation. This gentleman here.
Hi, Dave Johnston. Just wondering, generally speaking, or specifically speaking, would you say that the actual Trump administration desire is the actual defeat of Ukraine? Although it can't be overtly stated now, but with the motivation being to make Europe chronically feeble. Similarly, they don't expect all the nonsense about the far right, giving support to far right parties in Europe. It's just to cause a mess. No, but because a lot of this just doesn't make sense unless they want the defeat.
Of Ukraine or Europe?
No, Ukraine, the actual defeat. This is the unstated desire, because what they're doing doesn't make sense. Are we going to have a messy peace, or is it just going to tumble on indefinitely as it is? None of what is overtly said or occurs now makes any sense, but an actual desire for Ukrainian defeat does make sense given the current actions.
Professor?
I would disagree. I wouldn't say that they want a Ukrainian defeat. What I would say is that they don't care about Ukraine. They want the normalization of US-Russian relations because they think they can do a hell of business with the Russians. And this is where the Russians have been quite successful in basically making them believe that, by normalizing relations, the Trump administration can make big bucks. Yeah, and also, rare earths and raw materials and all this stuff, exploiting the Arctic and so on and so forth. So,
sorry for interrupting, but if there is the unrealized desire of the Russians to sort out Ukraine, Like, again, as you suggest, it's all about commercial relationships. It would be beautiful for the US if Russia realized its ambitions there, actually realized them, because they could trundle on with their commercial life. Because otherwise, if something's cobbled together now, it's only a sticking plaster. It's just going to fester indefinitely. And Russia will have, as you stated, this desire to bury them.
Yeah, but I mean, you underestimate, I think, two things. First of all, the Russians are determined to continue the war. This is something the Trump administration has to deal with. Secondly, I mean, if you look at the national security strategy, if you look at the way the MAGA camp looks at international relations, they're actually going back to some kind of 18th, 19th century international relations, which we used to have in Europe. Yeah. So great powers have their basically sphere of influence, and then they're cooperating. Yeah. And the national security strategy states very clearly that the sphere of interest of the US is the Western Hemisphere. This is the first time this Western Hemisphere plays such a prominent role since the Monroe Doctrine, or at least since the end of the Second World War. Usually it was, Asia, it was Europe, there is this kind of, I would say, secular US doctrine, which goes back to Senator Knox, who basically said in 1919, in one of his speeches, the US interest is to prevent an hegemon from controlling the countercoasts, so in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. They have given up on that. Yeah. So for them, basically, Europe doesn't play any role in security terms. And therefore, they don't care them if the Russians are basically provoking NATO. This is the president who said in 2017, I'm not going to risk a third world war for a country like Macedonia. Yeah. Secretary of Treasury Besant said, the Russians are already attacking NATO countries. I mean, he was referring to the whole hybrid threats stuff with drones and so on and so forth. But the Europeans should not expect that the American soldiers will be there to help them. So actually, they gave up any form of conventional security guarantee for Europe, which is a carte blanche for the Russians.
Does that mean Article 5 is dead?
Well, I think Article 5 took an extremely heavy beating. And if I were a European, I wouldn't bet on Article 5. It depends on the scenario. As I said, if the Russians were so stupid, which you never can rule out, to really try to conquer Poland, I think, we have a different game. But if they're clever enough and stop, or refrain from a large-scale military intervention, I think the Americans won't be there, full stop. The Americans won't be there. So this is now a European task, to make Europe so strong that we can deter Russia from any kind of provocation. Yeah? And I think it was Radoslav Sikorski who recently said, and I think this is something which is not very clear in the mind of a lot of politicians in Europe, we don't need to be as good in security terms as the Americans are. We just need to be better than the Russians. So, the ambition is not basically to become, as Europe, the second US with 13 carrier groups, being able to deploy worldwide and so on and so forth. We just need to be better than the Russians, which is a different level of ambition than to be as good as the Americans.
There's two people sitting side by side there. Why don't we take both questions one after the other?
Thank you. Dahi O'Kelly, Chair of the UK Group in the Institute. I have two questions. One, what do you think is the likely outcome of the talks which are currently taking place, the latest round in Germany?
Yeah.
And secondly, could you give us some idea of how you think this is going to end? What's going to happen in whatever's left of Ukraine after this deal?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Big questions. Thank you. Yes?
My question, okay. Dermot Dunyan, unaffiliated. My question is, taking a more global perspective, maybe this isn't just Europe's fight, And what are your thoughts about the fact that Canada has a stake in this? So does Australia, Japan, Korea, Philippines.
Let me answer the second question first. I recently wrote, together with a colleague of mine, a longer article about Germany's foreign policy in the future. And I said, you know, we need to reach out to exactly those countries. Yeah, we need to bring them closer to Europe, or the European countries who have common interests. And this is not something to recreate some kind of new West or whatever, but actually, if we want to preserve some form of order in the international system, which is an order basically which we benefit from, we need to reach out to countries who share a minimum of our interests. And you mentioned democratic countries. I would even go further, and I would go to semi-democratic countries in Africa and in Latin America, because wherever I travel, I don't see that much of an appetite to become basically dependent on China. But the problem is, in most of these countries, the Europeans aren't there. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the examples, I recently went to Peru. Peru is an extremely resource-rich country, yeah, full of raw materials and rare earths. It used to be the case that everything was in possession of 25 families. Therefore, Peru is actually a very poor country. But now the Chinese are getting into Latin America. And there are only 2 mines which are, as of today, left in the possession of Peruvian families. And I asked the officials, why did you allow basically the Chinese to buy the rest? And he said, there was no one else there. You know, historically speaking, they detest the Americans because of the imperial past. So, but the Europeans were not there. So there was no European counteroffer. So they gave it to the Chinese. Yeah. So I would work much closer together even with these kind of countries to counter Chinese influence. So we need to recreate some kind of new community which goes beyond Europe. Because as Europeans, we won't be able to survive in this new international system of the 21st century. Yeah, if we don't get partners, not only like-minded partners, as the saying goes, but also partners who are not that much like-minded, but not are brutal dictatorships, probably. So, did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Second question. I mean, the outcome of the talks, I said it twice today. What we saw the past 2 days in Berlin was a transatlantic therapy session. It has nothing to do with the war itself, full stop. This was, the US was talking to the Ukrainians were talking to the Europeans were talking to the Americans. Guess who was left out of the picture? The Russians. So these were talks to keep the US engaged in, you know, solving this war, in supporting Ukraine. Because the outcome, I mean, if there is an outcome, and I'm questioning it if there is an outcome, because my reading is that in the 3 big issues, there was not a lot of agreement. So we need to see if we see more text in the days to come. Yeah. But my sense was there was not that much of an agreement. But actually, this had nothing to do with the war itself. Yeah. Because did anyone ask the Russians what they think of it? And everyone knows that the Russians won't accept anything which is not the 28-point plan of the US administration. And even the 28-point plan, which I called a Versailles Treaty, just the difference is that, you know, not the aggressor was punished, but the victim is punished, and the aggressor is rewarded. That's the difference to the actual Versailles Treaty. Even this 28-point plan, which I would say, you know, I mean, you can't even offer more to the Russians than the 28-point plan. For the Russians was the beginning of negotiation. Do you really think that they will accept anything which is different than the 28 points of a couple of weeks ago? No. This was a transatlantic endeavor to keep the Americans engaged in supporting Ukraine to a certain extent. And therefore, I don't expect anything. So The question, how will this war end, is difficult to answer because it depends very much how long Europe and the US will support Ukraine with what they need. If the support goes on, this war might go on for a couple of years. Full stop. Because I don't see, I mean, as long as Putin, is not removed from power, I don't see any space for negotiations, which is not the maximum the Russians do demand, which is unacceptable for Europe and is unacceptable for Ukraine. So what is going on right now is, I would say there are two wars of attrition going on right now. One is against the Ukrainian forces in Ukraine, and the other one is a war of attrition of Ukraine against Russian infrastructure, especially oil and gas infrastructure. The question is who will get exhausted first? I can't answer. Yeah, I said it during the lunch we had, and I'm an academic, so whatever I say is on the record. The Ukrainian front lines are not collapsing. This is what the Russians are trying to make us believe, and they're very successful in trying to make us believe that the Ukrainian front lines are collapsing the next days or next weeks. That's not the case. Yeah, so this war can still go on for another couple of years, full stop. Yeah, low intensity probably, but it can still go on.
And if it goes on 2 more years, how will it end in 2 years? How would it?
Depends on how much pressure we can exert on Russia. So I mean, today is Wednesday, right? No, tomorrow is Wednesday. Thursday will be decisive. If the European Union will be able to basically give the Ukrainians, the frozen Russian assets, they can go on for another 2 years. So what I hear is that this policy won't be successful, that the Belgians are blocking, yeah, and they will block until the end. So if this happens, this of course, then Europe runs out of options. Because Putin had 2 strategies, and one was actually attrition against Ukraine on the front line. But since 2 years, he's speculating on basically our societies becoming so tired of supporting Ukraine that actually the political support will vanish. And this is exactly where we are right now. If you see weapon delivery to Ukraine, it dropped dramatically, even from a European point of view. Yeah, there are some trackers of weapon deliveries who are saying, in the last 6 months, 51% less. Maybe that's not accurate, but even if you say 30% less, it's going down. Armed forces do not know what to give anymore without, basically emptying their stocks completely. It is for every government, it's getting harder and harder to justify, paying a couple of million euros more for any support of Ukraine. So we are reaching a point where I see difficulties in sustaining the Ukrainian support by European governments. So, and
then we come up with the ending that's in your book.
Then it comes with the ending, which is in my book. And to be very clear, the ending which is in my book, that Russia gets what it wants, will basically put Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, in turmoil. The numbers are saying up to 10 million refugees after that. Yeah, from the territories the Russians are occupying, and even from the rest of Ukraine, where people don't see any, chances for their future. Expect Ukrainian political conflicts breaking out again, which we had before the start of the war, yeah, which will give the Russians a huge possibility to meddle into internal Ukrainian affairs and to support basically forces which are closer to Russia than the current government. And by the end of the day, the biggest risk we will face as Europeans, that by the end of the day, we will have 2 armies who are against Europe, the Russian army and the future Ukrainian army, if they feel betrayed.
This lady on the front row, we haven't had a woman ask a question yet. Please.
Thank you. Margaret Lee, unaffiliated. A lot of the European leaders have, presented themselves at the White House to fawn on the current document. Has that been an exercise in stupidity or in a failure to see what's really going on?
I mean, I'm a critic of the strategy of most of the European countries because we are reactive to what Trump does. We haven't reached the point for the past years to say, what is the European strategy in this war? Yeah. And trying basically to convince the Americans. I mean, not saying the Russians, because the Russians don't want to negotiate with the Europeans. Yeah, they want to negotiate only with the Americans. But we haven't developed a kind of strategy, a kind of plan, submitting to the US and saying, take part of that as your plan and negotiate that with the Russians. Yeah. This kind of, I found it extremely humiliating as a European when I listened to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who basically says, you know, I don't know what the situation was, that sometimes daddy has to come in and regulate the stuff or something like that. I found this, as a European, I found this extremely humiliating. I find it extremely humiliating for Zelensky, who basically gets one beating after the other and always has to say, I appreciate your leadership and thank you for your initiative and so on and so forth. I find this all extremely humiliating, but it's a reflection of the fact that we are so dependent on the US that basically they can play with us. Yeah. And this is the biggest mistake, basically. Yeah. We became so dependent on US support for Ukraine, on US protection of Europe, that actually they can do whatever they want to do with us. Yeah. And even with the national security strategy, I mean, this is a strategy which basically said, you are idiots. Yeah, all of your governments are idiots. And how is the reaction of European governments? Oh, don't take it so seriously. It's not nice, but you know, the foundations are very good and we will work it up. So this, I mean, from a European perspective, this is humiliation pure.
Absolutely. This gentleman, we'll take two questions at a time. Sir, the end of the row there. Yes, the mic is coming to you.
Thank you very much. Unaffiliated, I suppose. Read a few books over the years. That's about it. One that comes to mind at the moment, the chess master Garry Kasparov, and I think it was written in and around the time of either just before or just after the invasion of Crimea, and it was called "Winter is Coming," and it was very apt. Anyway, that's not actually the question. Just in the context of what we've been talking about, very dark and dangerous. There is, and you mentioned the Baltic states as being probably an obvious point for Russia to make further advances. Small countries on the border of Russia. There is a very small country on the western side of the European continent, on the edge of the Atlantic, which has extraordinarily, in my opinion, managed to put itself in a position where it's not a member of NATO, it's so-called military neutral, and it has absolutely no capacity whatever to defend itself in any shape or form. An act of negligence, I would suggest, on the part of successive governments, probably since at least the 1970s. I wonder, and you happen to be, of course, sitting in that very country as we speak. I just wonder, do you have any comments on our particular position and predicament that we've single-handedly landed ourselves in?
Yes, and I should add that Tom Healy asked the same question online. I'll take two questions. So Cian Fitzgerald, standing in the back, who is a senior researcher here at the IIEA, has a question.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that we, as Europeans, can't really count on NATO Article 5, which by extension probably means we can't count on the US's nuclear umbrella in this context. A lot of the focus that we're seeing is focusing very much so on conventional forces as a means to deter Russia. But in your view now, what is the role of nuclear deterrence and a European nuclear deterrent? I'm not talking about the Euro deterrent, but the role of the UK, France, and potentially should other states or are other states potentially looking at acquiring their own capabilities or sharing, or that's just the state of European nuclear deterrence in general? Thanks.
I answer too. Okay. I don't object any country who, for historical reason or whatever reason, is a neutral country. My problem is that in the case of Ireland, like in the case of Austria, I find it very bigot if you use your neutrality to basically save money in terms of defense policy. I mean, I know that this is changing in Ireland now. And relying on others, if push comes to shove, to defend you. This is bigotry, yeah? Because neutrality, if you take it seriously, is the assumption that you stay out of everything, but then you can't expect anyone to come to your rescue, which at the end of the day leads to higher defense spending, because you have to take care of every possible scenario to defend yourself against any possible attack. Neutrality, or to think, let's put it this way, to think that neutrality means that you won't be attacked by anyone is of course stupid, because neutrality depends on third parties to accept it. And as you saw recently with some little nice drones trying to take down probably the plane Zelensky was taking off, apparently some countries do not accept your neutrality. Yeah? And a ballistic missile which comes from Russia and wants to hit the target in Britain, if the best way is over your airspace, it will go over your airspace. Your neutrality won't be accepted. So my point is, you can stay neutral. I don't have any problem with that, but then take care of yourself. Yeah? If you, for whatever reasons, are not able to take care of yourself, you don't have to give up neutrality. That's not my point. But then start cooperating closer and be more active. Yeah? And then, of course, I mean, there is something which has not that much to do with neutrality, but I know a bit of your recent history. And I know that the Irish governments are always proud of the role Ireland played in peacekeeping missions. And this was a kind of substitute to say, look, I mean, we're active, but, you know, under different circumstances. I mean, I don't expect that many mandates of the UN Security Council in the future. So, you know, this argument will be taken out of your hands. So my point is, look, the Swiss Department of Defense, 3 days ago, I think, 3 days ago, published a new paper, so some kind of defense directions for Switzerland. Of course, they want to stay neutral. Yeah, they have this traditional neutrality forever. But they say, you know, this is the most dangerous situation Switzerland is in since the end of the Second World War. And thereby, we need to invest more in our defense. We need to reform our armed forces, and we need to increase our cooperation with others. And I think this should be the Irish way. You know, I mean, I know that, you know, neutrality, I mean, if I'm in Austria, if I'm here, this is a toxic issue. I mean, don't expect any party to lobby for whatever, NATO membership, or they're going to be killed in the next elections probably, because it's so deeply rooted in the self-perception, you know, of large parts of the population that Ireland is neutral. But be honest to people. Yeah, neutrality means at the end of the day, you have to invest more in defense, because you can't rely upon any other one, because you're not member of an alliance. If you don't want to be a member of an alliance, fine by me. But then take the money at hand and explain it to your people that you need to invest more in defense. Yeah, this is the consequence of neutrality. Neutrality is not something which is cost saving. It's extremely costly if you take it seriously. And people should take it seriously. That is my answer. Nuclear is really the most difficult question in this whole, you know, what will happen in the future. I mean, so far, maybe I missed it, but so far there are no indications from the US with regard to the nuclear umbrella. The problem is if they start withdrawing their troops here, then of course the old NATO question comes up. Are they really willing to risk the destruction of New York for the liberation of any European city? And of course, I mean, you know, if you go back to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the answer was always like that the Europeans were saying no. Therefore, we need their conventional presence much stronger here in Europe. We need this kind of nuclear sharing agreement so that there is a connection between strategic deterrence and tactical deterrence. I think the way we discuss the nuclear issue right now is for the time being the right one. This is how to amend the US nuclear umbrella. And this can only be done by Great Britain and France. And it's a difficult debate as far as I hear from those who are involved in this debate. But for the time being, this is the only way, yeah, to get a bit more of a harder nuclear deterrence for Europe than we have right now. If there is a situation where the US would say, we're done, you don't get even the nuclear umbrella, then we have to rethink the whole issue from the scratch. And this won't be easy. There's no easy solution because, I mean, the Brits now have decided to go for some form of tactical deterrence, but it will take time. France doesn't have tactical deterrence, it just has strategic deterrence. So then you have to set up some kind of European nuclear sharing agreement. This will take time. I mean, you know, producing the devices, training, doctrine, and so on and so forth. And the problem is that within this time span, which might last for 10 years, we're extremely vulnerable and open to nuclear blackmailing by the Russians, which they're already making very successfully since the beginning of the war. I don't have an answer for you. This is a really complicated question.
Gosh, I sort of feel like I feel badly because we've got all these questions coming in from all over Ireland. Why don't we take a couple of the internet ones and then we'll
You're the MC.
Okay. This is from Maureen Junker-Kenny of Trinity College, Dublin. How do you judge Mark Rutte's warning that Europe has to prepare for the possibility of a war on the scale our grandparents and parents had to endure, i.e. First and Second World Wars? And I'll give you two questions at once. A question from Patrick Burke. A large part of the Chinese economy is driven by trade with the West. Based on the scenario presented, is the West essentially funding its own destruction?
I mean, first of all, to the Rutte remark, I mean, actually, to deter Russia, even from a minor aggression, we have to prepare for a large-scale war, yes. I mean, if we don't signal the Russians that we are basically, that actually we are preparing for a large-scale war, we won't be able, that's a nice tone. We won't be able to deter them because Russia is basically relying on mass. Yeah, if we don't signal that we are able to counter this kind of mass, we won't deter them because they will think that at the end they can outlast us. The problem is we're preparing for that in the sense that, you know, most of the European armed forces have now huge procurement programs to get, you know, whatever they need, the tanks, the fighter jet, the frigates, the drones, blah, 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 blah. I don't think that our societies are prepared for that. And this is what is my major concern. You know, I mean, you can have armed forces which are up to the task, but they won't be able to fulfill their task if you don't have societies who accept, who are willing to accept the price you have to pay once such a scenario breaks out. And I'm not talking only about the price of, you know, wounded and fallen soldiers. I'm talking about the political and economic price which comes along with a major war. If you don't have resilient societies, and we don't have resilient societies, the further away you go from Moscow, the less resilient our societies are. If you don't have resilient societies, you should not even start thinking about sending your forces to the eastern flank because they won't be able to perform the mission. You lose wars on two fronts, on the battlefield and at the home front. And if the home front is not ready and willing to pay the price of such a major confrontation, you better don't get engaged in such a scenario. And that's my major problem when it comes to most of the European countries. Of course, the closer I go to Moscow, the more resilient these societies are. Yeah, but the further away I go from Moscow, and there are the most capable armies. Sorry to say, you know, I mean, it's Italy, it's Germany, it's France, it's Great Britain. The less resilient the societies are, and this is where we have to put a much higher emphasis on, besides procurement policies and so on and so forth. Well, at the end of the day, well, this is a catch-22 question, you know. Yes, of course. I mean, we contributed partly to the destruction is a too harsh word, because let me say, I mean, I would say something about, I don't want to let you go into your Christmas vacation being totally depressed by this talk here. I know that alcohol is always a solution, but you shouldn't get drunk for 2 weeks in a row. Well, actually, what we underestimated is basically, you know, the will of these kind of powers to overthrow us. And actually, what we did, of course, I mean, by integrating China into the world economy, where I say, you know, we didn't have any chance then to do so. I mean, how can you refuse 1.3 billion people, you know, of getting richer and participating in what, you know, every one of us consider as part of the human rights? But we absolutely overestimated the effect on China. So we thought that this will change China, yeah, and it didn't change China. The Chinese exploited very cleverly, you know, the opportunities we gave them. They became richer, which is of course absolutely fine. But we thought by them getting richer, they will become more peaceful, and they will become more like us. And this was the major mistake we did. Yeah, they didn't become like us, and when we realized that they didn't become like us, it was already too late. Yeah, by buying Russian gas and oil, we thought that, of course, we tied the Russians so close into our own economy that there is no appetite for going to war or having any aggression against any other country, and this was a mistake. I don't know who of you read Norman Agnell, the guy who wrote this book in 1912, where basically he showed that Great Britain is so intertwined with the European economies, and the Europeans are so basically becoming dependent on each other economically, that there is no incentive of going to war against each other. This is a book he wrote in 1912. Everyone knows what happened in 1940. Yeah. So, and this is basically a mistake we repeated again. Let me just say, as I said, because you said we need to stop. I don't want you to get out depressed here. I'm very optimistic that we can survive in what is upcoming to us, and we can even win, you know, this battle for a new world order, if our societies do realize what they have forgotten since the end of the Second World War, that you should not take democracy for granted, that democracy has to be defended. And partly, of course, this is a small part, partly it is defending democracies by military means. But the large part for each of us is defending democracy on a day-to-day level with those who are basically becoming more skeptical. And I see this skepticism in all over Europe, becoming more skeptical if democracy is really the societal system, the political system, which is able to basically solve the day-to-day problem of ordinary people. So if democracies did win the two major battles of the 20th century, the one against fascism and the one against communism. And then there is no reason to be pessimistic that democracies won't survive even in the 21st century. But the precondition is that we rediscover this spirit that democracy has to be defended, and that you can't take democracy for granted. And actually, our success in most of the European countries is that we're living now in the second or second and a half generation who knows nothing else than more or less security, stability, and economic progress. I mean, we can't even imagine that democracies can vanish, yeah, and can be destroyed. Look at the US, what is happening in 9 months in terms of democratic quality of this political system. Yeah, we are not immune. Our democracies are not immune. for good and forever. They have to be defended. And if we rediscover the spirit, I have no pessimism. I'm pretty optimistic that we will survive even in the 21st century, but that's a precondition.
I think that's a...
Is that a happy note enough for you for Christmas? The problem is whether I will have a quick answer.
Sorry, my name is Pat Kennedy. From the very beginning, NATO has shown itself to be very weak. And just answer me the question, from the first day, we had 9 months of a warning that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. Why didn't NATO put troops on the ground in Ukraine? Would that have stopped the Russians going in?
Well, very quick answer, because most of NATO countries didn't believe that the Russians would invade.
No.
Full stop. No, I mean, I just take my own external secret service, intelligence service, who didn't believe the informations they got from Washington and from London, yeah, but said, okay, we don't believe that the Russians will invade, but maybe it's better to evacuate our embassy. But we didn't believe it until the Russians did it. And this was the case in France, this was the case in Italy, this was the case in Spain. They didn't believe that the Russians were so crazy to go in.
Even Volodymyr Zelensky
didn't believe
they were going to invade. In fact, he asked the Americans and the British to stop saying this because it was hurting his economy.
Our chief of the external intelligence service, the day the Russians invaded Ukraine, was in Ukraine and had to be evacuated by Polish special forces because the guy didn't believe that the Russians would come in, although he had every information from Washington, from London.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Masala. That was terrific.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.